So, what is Navigator really? It's essentially an extension of my mind in the digital realm. I literally have a search engine of many of the lessons I've learned over the past 5 years. For example, like I collect, when I'm reading things online, I collect examples of ancient wisdom. So, situations where the ancient civilizations actually had a lot of knowledge and kind of were more sophisticated than one usually imagines. So I type in ancient wisdom and I have all of these examples um, of ancient wisdom essentially. So expand this. And this is, I'm blanking on his name, but from the author of Black Swan. Taleb, Nassim Taleb. Where was that? Here we go. So from Nassim Taleb, he writes a lot about things that are lindy, meaning they've survived the test of time, and these are some of the ideas that have survived the test of time that the ancients had. So cognitive dissonance, the idea of loss aversion, being more worried about losses rather than enthusiastic about gains. So there's a bunch of examples here. So this here's actually came up something that I had written doing a demo for Navigator. It's all about ancient wisdom once again. So here's an ancient wisdom technology example. So these are fire bricks. These are designed to withstand super high heat. This is like technology that they came up with thousands of years ago. Concrete is a good example. I mean, it's someone had a Twitter thread on this, but they wrote basically that we figured out how to work with liquid rock. That's what concrete is. And the Romans in particular had a kind of concrete that I think we didn't have until recently, but basically it survived underwater. So yeah, so Philip Bruin, research scientist at DuPont, who has studied the engineering properties of Roman monuments. It's the most durable building material in human history. And I say that as an engineer not prone to hyperbole. And so this is a technology that we had thousands of years ago in the Roman Empire. So there's a bunch of these examples of, this is an interesting one, of chia seed warrior balls. I actually don't have anything here. I just said research, but yeah. So that's one example, ancient wisdom. Another kind of trend that I like, that I collect research on, is human fallibility. So where do we get things wrong? And here'll be a bunch of research about human fallibility. These are some of the things that I've saved. And so anytime I get into arguments or debates, or I want to tell someone about something, I have this as a resource to be able to pull up, and essentially these are my notes. Anytime I actually take a note about human fallibility, so let's say I find a good example of things where we got something wrong, and I start typing into here, all of these will come up and remind me of the prior research, and so I'm getting kind of like a spaced repetition effect. Speaking of which, spaced repetition is very powerful, a feature of Navigator, because whenever I take a note and I get suggested my prior research, it serves to remind me of that research and lets my brain know that it's important. So actually, if we go to spaced repetition. Okay. And so now I have to communicate to you guys what spaced repetition is, and I can just pull up my notes. So let's see, advantage of spaced repetition. So our ability to remember a piece of information depends critically on the number of times we have reviewed it, the temporal distribution of the reviews, and the time elapsed since the last review, as first shown by a seminal study by Ebbinghaus. So again, so it depends critically on the number of times we have reviewed it and the temporal distribution of the reviews. That our ability to remember a piece of information essentially depends on how often we viewed it and the distribution of those views in time. And so there's apps out there that will basically keep spacing out your interaction with whatever piece of information you're trying to remember to make you memorize that piece of information. And it's very effective. You can learn things very efficiently and effectively that way, because you're only getting it at certain times with big spaces in between, and the moment you start to forget it, these spaced repetition apps will show it to you again right before you forget it, and it lets your brain know, oh, this is important. And so there's kind of a similar effect here, where when I'm actually taking a note, so if I'm taking a note like, ancient wisdom concrete, and I found another example of this. There's actually a Twitter stream that I mentioned, and let's say I wanted to save it, I would write this in, and I would immediately be presented with, ancient wisdom technology concrete, about this harbor concrete by the Romans. And so I'm learning, I'm basically being re-taught this information. Anyways, so here, that's just kind of some examples of the things that I've been saving for myself in fallibility. Yeah, so here's the latest one. So this one is interesting because it basically, this talks about a study where the premise was that genes cause disease, and that people had genetic predispositions towards certain disease, and if you could use technologies like CRISPR to fix them, then you would make great progress in getting rid of disease. But what the research found was that actually everyone has genetically, except for a few exceptions, like sickle cell anemia, I think, except for a few exceptions, almost all disease, everyone has an average risk for all disease, which implies that really people don't have a genetic disposition to disease, that they actually, it's all up to their environment and their personal choices, which is actually good news, because it means that disease is largely under your control for the most part. That, if you find different environments or take different actions, then you can alleviate your risk of disease. It's not something that's genetically determined. And so this was something that we got wrong. People actually did this study thinking that it would prove their point, but it disproved their thesis, which was that people are genetically predisposed to disease. It actually proved the opposite, that they're not. This is just some philosophy stuff. So this is human fallibility. Oh, so actually, it basically, this talks about the idea that humans are fallible because we have we have limited mental resources and are functioning in a complex system, and we can only deal with so much information that our environment will overwhelm us. There's no way that we can, model the universe essentially around us, and we kind of have to almost do trial and error, and so that's why we are so fallible. That's why we make so many mistakes. I mean, this talks about, how the news media freaked out about the Amazon fire, and that it actually isn't as big a problem as it was in 2003. That forest fires have declined 25% since 2003. You would never have known that from the coverage of the Amazon fires this past summer. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff about how we got a bunch of medicine wrong, nutrition, food pyramid and nutritional advice, so we got that completely wrong. Things in economics and statistics. So basically, we get a lot of stuff wrong. We should be humans should have a lot of humility. And it kind of, it makes me think about, all of the, political arguments today, and both sides have so much righteousness. And they should have a lot more humility, because there's a very good chance they're getting something wrong on both sides of the political aisle, just humans in general. We should be much more careful